Why are the prices of these anime figures so different? Well, if you're new to figure collecting, you should know that anime figures are a lot more complicated than you think. Though not all figures are the same, there are some common guidelines to know if a figure is good quality and worth your money. Today, let's give a rundown of the very basic differences in anime figures that veteran collectors look out for, especially when it comes down to price range. So, we're going to break it down to three categories, from the relatively cheap prize figures, to the averagely priced pop-up parades, to the expensive scales. There's also Nendoroids, but that's another story. Let's start with the figures that make up the lowest tier. Prize figures. Prize figures are generally the cheapest and the gateway into figure collecting. These kinds of figures are mass-produced, often at a lower quality than other kinds of figures. But nowadays, there are some that are being made at higher quality than usual, but we'll get to that in a bit. Setting up prize figures is easier than other figures too, including Nendoroids and scales. Normally, you would simply get a figure and a base, and you just stick them together. The name prize figures derives from how they're generally obtained in Japan, which is usually through UFO catchers or crane games. Like the name suggests, these figures are technically made to be won instead of bought. But since a lot of people aren't in Japan or just suck at these games, like I do, it's becoming more common for online sites to sell prize figures now. Aside from the lower price point, their packaging is also much simpler in every sense, because, well, they're literally meant to drop when you win them. Some manufacturers, like Tenitol, are releasing premium prize figures under brands such as Artist Masterpiece. We get that factors like character popularity can drastically affect price, but prize figures generally range anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000 Japanese yen. Premium prize figures can range around 5,000 to 6,000 yen, sometimes even more. But because they're relatively affordable and the setup is low stress and even lower stakes, these are arguably the best figures for beginners. Now, let's go up a level to a more recently established tier of figures. There isn't a universal name for these tier of figures, but if prize figures were like the lower tier, then pop-up parades are the middle tier. And they include brands like Pop-Up Parade from Good Smile Company and Tenitol from Fujio, a company that also produces prize figures in scales. So there's some overlap. The concept of these figures is to be of higher quality than prize figures, but still be affordable. The paint jobs are supposed to be cleaner and slightly more ambitious, and these figures are supposed to theoretically undergo more quality control, though not everyone thinks that. Pop-Up Parade started in 2019. It was Good Smile Company's attempt to sell figures that could be quickly produced and easy to collect, as the figures were only going to be 17 to 18 centimeters tall. And their gamble paid off. It turned out to be a huge success. Since production of these figures took much less time, the wait between pre-orders and completion usually takes around 4 months. Scales, on the other hand, can sometimes take years between pre-orders and actually receiving the figure. The success of Pop-Up Parade has likely pushed other manufacturers to create similar brands, as we've seen with Fujio releasing their first Tenitol figures back in February. Tenitol has actually gone even further by creating unique bases with their figures, while Pop-Up Parade bases are honestly boring. This tier of figures is still young, so there's a lot of room to grow. You can expect these mid-tier figures to cost anywhere around 4,800 to 7,000 yen. Finally, we have scales, and these guys are really the big leagues. Their sizes vary a lot, but the most common ones to based off of a character's height are 1/8, 1/7, 1/6, and the crazy 1/4. In comparison, Pop-Up Parades are around 1/10 in scale, while prize figures and Nendoroids are non-scale. There isn't a consistency with scales. Some go really extra, while others are more modest. But here are some things you can expect when shopping for scales. One is the paint, which should be a lot more nuanced and clean compared to other tiers. The bases and poses for these figures are oftentimes designed to bring to life a scene from the franchise or leave room for imagination. The best figures tend to be characters in mid-movement, where their hair, clothes, or accessories are suspended. However, most scales are much harder to set up than the lower and mid-tier figures, because they can get very complicated and potentially require a lot of different parts to be assembled, not to mention the fact that they can take up way more space. But the idea is that these kinds of figures are for people who are deep into the hobby, just plain rich, or really need that figure of best girl. That doesn't always mean scale figures are guaranteed to be of good quality though. Despite how expensive some of these scales can get, there are some that are still low quality. A few companies, like Union Creative, can often be a hit or miss, and that's due to a lot of reasons, like not getting a character's likeness down, or the figures being too complex for their own good. Price-wise, they can be very expensive due to the amount of time and detail each production takes. They can start at anywhere from around 12,000 to literally millions of yen, or thousands of dollars. And they can also then jump in price, depending on a whole ton of reasons. Obviously, you can see that there's some overlap between the tiers. As the figure industry grows and demand gets stronger, the borders between these categories of figures may get more blurry. But depending on your preference on size and budget, and honestly just whatever you like, breaking anime figures down into these categories might be the best introduction point to this world of figures. Obviously, this is a very practical way to look at anime figures, and there are a lot of caveats that can send you down a rabbit hole. At the end of the day, what's most valuable and worth your time and money, regardless of what tier it's from, is up to you.